Mere Orthodoxy has a brand new website. We've completely redesigned our website with readers in mind. From the layout to dark mode, downloadable PDFs and audio articles, a new dashboard for members that lets you bookmark articles, save quotes to a commonplace book, access your full reading history, get digital editions of all the past journals, site themes based on the church calendar, and much more. There has never been a better time to become a member of Mere Orthodoxy than right now. Through the end of June, get 20% off your first year of an annual membership or 3 months of a monthly membership. Not only will you get access to an incredible online experience, you'll support the ongoing work of Mere Orthodoxy, Mere Fidelity, and much more to come. Mere Orthodoxy is a reader-supported publication. We can do this work because of readers and listeners like you. Go to mereorthodoxy.com today to see the new site and get 20% off your first year of an annual membership or 3 months of a monthly membership. That's mereorthodoxy.com to see the new site and get 20% off membership today.
This episode is brought to you by Lexham Press, who publishes books that love the Word, love the faith, and love the church. Lexham Press is an imprint of the Baker Publishing Group. Our June book of the month is The Pursuit of Character, Recovering the Virtues by Matthew Arbo. You can receive a 30% discount on this title and all previous books of the month by visiting bakerbookhouse.com/pages/Mere Fidelity. You can find that link in our show notes to get 30% off of our book of the month from Lexham Press. Hello and welcome to another episode of Mere Fidelity, a podcast by Mere Orthodoxy, where we think about the Word of God and the world we live in. My name is Derek Rishmael, and I'll be your host for the day, and I'm joined by regular cast and crew members, Alistair Roberts and James Wood. Good to see you, fellas.
Glad to be here.
So today we thought we'd take up an interesting subject that Alistair proposed. We're kind of nicknaming it the
accusation, Derek.
Yes, it is. The kind of the Elijah syndrome, and kind of we're going to be dealing with institutional dynamics and outsider perspectives, and I thought it might be helpful to kind of reflect on that as I'm prepping to head in a couple of weeks towards General Assembly. There's for the PCA, there's a lot of General Assemblies happening. There's SBC, whatever they call their massive gathering that dwarfs ours, but whatever. There's there's just a lot of institutional gatherings and decision-making processes that are or aren't going very well from the outside, and so we thought it might be good to reflect on that as folks who have been on the inside and on the outside and inhabited both spaces at the same time. So, Alistair, why don't you go ahead and lead us in on that and kind of set up the problem that we want the first problem we want to start kind of peeling that onion, however you want to think about it.
Certainly. Well, the idea of the title comes from the book of 1 Kings, which describes the ministry of Elijah. He's a desert prophet challenging the corruption of the idolatrous regime of the Amorite king Ahab and his queen Jezebel, and their persecution of the servants of God. Now, within his context, he's outside of the institution. He's speaking against its corruption and calling for condemnation of it. He has this conviction that everyone else has abandoned the truth, that he alone is left. Whereas when the Lord speaks to him at Horeb, he declares that there have been many who have not bowed the knee yet to idols, many who are still faithful. And within the institution, within Ahab's regime, there is the character of Obadiah, who protects a number of the prophets of the Lord in a way that Elijah would not have been able to do outside of that institution. Now, within the context that we have of social media, there is a lot of comment upon different institutions, how they handle certain things, the problematic associations that there might be within institutions, the ways in which certain sins are not dealt with or maybe not speedily addressed. And it's very easy to form an impression of an institution from without, one that maybe does not tally very well with what's happening within. On the other hand, as those within institutions, we find ourselves dealing with issues in our immediate context, and maybe being a bit more patient and taking a bit more time and being a bit more forgiving of certain things than we are when we address and consider other institutions from without. And so I want us to think very much about that tension. How do you view institutions in terms of their faithfulness from without and from within? How do we maintain purity from without? How do we from within? How do we challenge effectively institutions to purity from without just engaging in a sort of purity spiral that ends up helping no one? How do we encourage holiness and righteousness and honesty in our institutions? How do we maintain trust? All of these questions, I think, are raised by this. And so whether it's the Obadiah complex or the Elijah complex, I want us to think about that sort of tension.
Yeah, and I think an issue, like a related theme, would be the nature of compromise. Is compromise, obviously we know there's a moral form of compromising that is bad, and you want to avoid at all costs, and you don't want to compromise the truth. But there are other types of compromises that you make in coalitions of all sorts, whether that's you're at an educational institution, you're in a political coalition, you are in a denomination, you're on a committee and you're writing a report.
Just to pull things at random.
I wouldn't wish that upon my worst enemies. But you have to figure out there are tactics involved also, even if you retain a certain moral compass that you really, really believe in, you have to think about tactics. And the big question is, I think that a lot of the skeptics of what I just said would say, well, just by virtue of playing those games of tactics, have you already obscured your moral compass, right?
It comes to mind when I was younger, the kind of thoughts I had about the compromises I would or wouldn't make as a parent, as a father. We're never going to just make the food. Just make it. They'll eat it. It's just going to be, and there's stuff that you look at, and that's a silly example, or the stuff that you thought when I was in seminary, or when I was the young college director at a church at like 24. I was like, well, this staff meeting, why doesn't you just say this? And it's like, okay, all right, buddy, you finished your exegetical paper last Tuesday, your last exegetical paper last Tuesday, and you're going to run the thing. Like there's just an experiential dynamic of just not knowing if you've never been in that spot. That doesn't excuse everything. Obviously, there are just right ways to parent and wrong ways to parent, and there's right ways to pastor and wrong ways to pastor. But the realism of what you think is possible and what you think is wise or good, when you're dealing with people, when you're confronting with people face to face, as not just pieces of a puzzle or a problem to be solved, but like actual partners in the work of ministry or partners in the work of an institution, or actually just stakeholders who you don't have absolute power over. You actually just have to work with them to get anything done. That just changes the calculus a lot when you start to inhabit those kinds of positions, when you get in a position to do anything, right? This is the classic story of, the politician who comes in, he's going to be a reformer. And then within 5 years, somehow, like the kinds of associations he had to make to get the funding, to raise the support, to get into the job, to get a motion passed, to, trade some cows for some pigs so that his piece of legislation that he really cares about, that's really super important, has to get through. And then by 5 years in, you're like, wow, you're really the man. Like, you really sold out. It's like, well, did he, or did he get the legislation that he wanted as far as he could? So all of those things are I think it's a universal experience across various kinds of institutions. Right? And thinking about compromising in marriage, right? You ever want, I'm never going to morally compromise with my wife. No, you don't want to morally compromise with your wife or your spouse, whatever. But you're going to compromise on something. Like you're going to have to make.
Wish egalitarian, Derek.
Yeah. No, you got to. Yeah. There's whatever. There's comments. Some of the biggest patriarchs, are just dominated. But the reality is, like, just to live in an understanding way, even with somebody you have to make space, right? And from the outside, it might look like you're getting pushed around, and that's not something you often understand until you're actually inside of the choice dynamic. And so that's just it's something I've seen is when somebody doesn't have skin in the game, when somebody doesn't have a stake in the institution, it is easier to throw a bomb that might burn the thing down, because it is an abstract. It's an abstract choice, right? You're often not considering the relational stakes involved or the domino effects of the various choices that follow the choice that you're advocating until you're actually in the room.
Considering just how many goods are liable to be lost if you fight battles on every hill. There is also the limitation of your resources. You cannot fight battles on every hill. You cannot die on every hill. You have to choose your battles. You have to recognize when you're faced with superior forces that you need to negotiate in other ways. And the example of parenting, I think, is a good one, that if you're going to work with a young child, you cannot just get them to act on your terms. They're a young child and they require negotiation of who they are and their issues. And you also have to compromise with them in a way that shows understanding and grace and are willing to not take the sort of reformation without tarrying for any approach, but to actually work with them step by step and to move them as much as possible towards the good, while recognizing that there are a lot of compromises that will need to be made along the way. One of the things I found helpful in thinking about this is Oliver O'Donovan's treatment of something like the law concerning divorce in the Old Testament, where the sense people have reading Matthew 19 is that was a bad law. Moses was giving them a law that was less than good, just resigning himself to the situation. Whereas O'Donovan argues that was the right law for the situation. It was a law that recognized that this is a society that's falling short in a lot of different ways, and you have to negotiate the actual reality. And so the law that is appropriate in that situation is one that will have to wrestle with the breakdown of marriages, that will have to ensure that the damage is minimized and that people are led towards, as much as possible, a society in which marriage is held in high esteem and marriage bonds are preserved. Now, we can't just go straight from A to B. We have to work with the actual situation that we face. Sometimes, for instance, we feel very strongly against something, and yet prudential legislation would have to negotiate it in ways that are far less categorical. I mean, whatever views I might have about AI, I have to think about what is actually going to work, what actually has any chance of passing, what is the sort of policy that we can take towards this that people are likely to have any traction. And that requires compromises, in part because it requires a recognition of where we are and what possibilities are open to us. And that's a lot of the work of politics, which is necessarily compromised, but not necessarily compromised in a deep moral way.
To steelman the outsiders, to maybe ask a question, so once you inhabit an institution of, whether it's family or a church, right? I often tell my students, like, because I train the ministry students here at Redeemer, and, the stakes get raised so high once you think about getting ordained. They already are raised higher once you join a denomination member, and then the stakes are really high once you get ordained, because you are really constrained in real ways. And that constraining has real positive effects, and it is felt. But it's easy, even like ecclesiastically, right? Like just like generally, even just theologically, to look when you're beginning your theological trajectory, and you of course have all the right theological convictions and opinions, and on all these other organizations are flawed in these various ways. But then you've got to figure out well, how do, if I, I'm obviously being sarcastic. If you don't, you're going to continue to grow and et cetera, et cetera. But I think your demeanor has to change once you join something. And you can still seek to reform it, but now that reform looks different. But to steelman the case of the outsider, the agitators, and especially it just seems like this phenomenon of the outside Elijah complex purist who, has all these critiques, but doesn't see everything from the inside. It does seem like this is exacerbated by the online ecosystem.
I was going to say.
So you can build a whole audience this way on social media. This is a very popular way to build a whole audience, and you're just constantly throwing bombs at these institutions that you wish were something else. And I just want, but okay, so steelman them though. I think the outsiders, like we were talking about politics, the reformers who get really excited about somebody taking office who's coming from the outside. They're not in the system. They're going to come drain the swamp, and then they get in there and they got to work in the swamp, right?
Yeah, you get swampy.
Yeah, they got to get a little swampy. But is there something generative about that dialectic?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that, like, this is not me saying, well, I'm not gonna name some names, but there are some outside candidates who I wish would get some attraction, put it that way, in my state, for all sorts of reasons, because of the fact of, when you have an entrenched uniparty or just single party that, then if you're always going to be in power and there's never any pressure on the system, you have no motivation to compromise, get things done, be better, anything like that, because you're just there, right? I absolutely think that once one of those people gets in, you have to work in the swamp. There's a difference between working in the swamp and becoming a swamp creature, right? Like there's a difference between who's got the boots on, he's in there, he's getting dirty, and it's like, okay, no, but you're Swamp Thing. You're actually that is your world. You embrace it. You actually embrace the darkness. You like the backroom deals. It is an intrinsic good that you're pulling the strings of power in ways that benefit you and all that sort of thing. So I absolutely do think that you need people coming in from the outside regularly, and this is why I do think that, I mean, Israel's structure in the Old Testament, you have prophets, you have the kings, you have the priests, you have the judges, and then God would raise up prophets, and you even have companies of prophets, and it was like a regular, necessary exertion on the system that is always going to tend towards kind of moral entropy, right? And so I actually think you need that general kind of storing of non initially compromised outsiders who they have different stakes, right? They have other stakes that they are trying to bring to bear. I mean, this is like cultures, this is societies where there's the dominant culture, and then there's the subaltern, communities that kind of change the conversation. So I absolutely think that is necessary. And so it may be the case that you think about Soren Kierkegaard's critique of Christendom, right? And I can't remember which of his friends he was telling, as he was like, he was going to die soon. He's like, I know I was an overcorrective. Like, I know I was extreme. Like, I know I went too far, but I needed to. There was this Yeah, it's like, I have to be a negation. I have to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to be strong enough. I can't actually be reasonable in that way. And, it's hard in the middle of history to say, like, well, I'm going to intentionally be over. I mean, I know, wink, wink, I know I'm being extreme, but I have to do this for the sake of the system. Weirdly, in the providence of history, I think sometimes, like, God has to, like, have people who, in a sense, don't get it yet, haven't been on the inside, that just for the sake of moving the moral Overton window, or the systemic Overton window to get anything done. So, yes.
I think compromise point that I mentioned earlier is relevant here as well, though. Like, because I think about this with the people who are just saying they're pushing the Overton window, right? And there might be a place for that in certain respects, on certain issues at certain times. But I think they're often naive to how their own judgment increasingly gets clouded as they kind of give themselves over to that.
Yeah. No, I mean, you said steelman, but I mean, the reality is, there are unfortunately, there are perverse incentives to be an outsider. to build your platform to, hey, fund my Patreon while I stick it to the man, et cetera, and hey, why don't you grow our growing network of people who are sticking it to the man? And hey, we've got a conference coming up about sticking it to the man. We've got these 5 speakers alongside us who are also doing great work of sticking it to the man. You should support their organizations too. Realize we're also becoming a 501c3, and if your dollars would just that happens, right? So I think the problem is there's a dishonesty in recognizing that happens, and there's an incentive structure to be outside. There's a nice thing though. One other just addition is, it's actually just really fun sometimes in the online ecosystem to blow stuff up from the outside and then walk away that you don't actually, you're not left holding the bag of any kind of relational integrity that you have to hold things together. Sometimes being put in a position of authority or power where you're holding things together. It's kind of like what those movies where the bad guy has to get away. Yeah, bad guy's trying to get away, and the cop's there, and he's like going to chase him, but he's like, here, let me blow up this part of the bridge, and so Superman has to go. You have to choose between chasing me or saving the people on the bridge. There's almost something like that when it comes to institutions where you're like, okay, I can deal with the outside critiques, but oftentimes to even do that, I would have to neglect a lot of the relational caregiving and binding together of communities that are the work of oftentimes institutional insiders. And now for a quick word from one of our sponsors. Beeson Divinity School is an interdenominational evangelical seminary on the campus of Sanford University in Birmingham, Alabama. I've been there. It is actually a lovely campus. Led by world-renowned faculty, Beeson forms students in person in a kind of a community-oriented model of theological education, and they have top-ranked scholars who engage their students at kind of very small class sizes. It's a warm environment. And now, thanks to a generous gift, Beeson is actually offering new full tuition scholarships for the 2025-2026 incoming class for their flagship degree, the Master of Divinity. So this kind of makes the whole thing more affordable than it's ever been. Now, these scholarships cover the cost of tuition and fees for 3 years, which is the average time it takes to finish the MDiv. And I'll be honest and say, I wish I had known about this or had an opportunity to look at this one when I was heading to seminary. So if you're interested, you can apply and learn more information at beesondivinity.com. Alistair, you've been silent for a while. This whole conversation is your fault. Say something.
I think there are a number of things I want to add at this point. First of all, I think it was James made the point of other groups with ends of their own that are distinct. This, I think, is really important for things like the practice of academia, the practice of pastors, the practice of journalists, for instance, that there are institutions within a free society that are frustrations to those who are just pursuing who are within institutions in ways that could easily end up being reduced to the ends of serving the interest of the institution itself, rather than some greater end beyond that, of the common good, of truth, whatever it is. And so I think when we have those institutions that we refuse to just submit to the ends of institutional politics or more general politics, and we pursue in ways that are quite politically inexpedient truth, faithful reporting, these sorts of things, that can be quite conducive to the healthful form of communities and institutions. It can encourage reform. And for instance, if you're engaged in the work of theology, as we are within this podcast, we're always engaged in this sort of negotiation between thinking seriously about theological questions and recognizing that I'm not going to reform my church overnight. And if I were to try to, I'd destroy it. And so we're negotiating between these deep theological principles that we hold, the ideas that we might have about optimal practice of Christian worship, and the fact that we have a form of worship that we find quite suboptimal within our churches, or we have a particular understanding of the celebration of the sacraments that differs from our church. Are you going to impose your ideology upon the church and expect that they reform and lose a lot of the actual communion of the church for the sake of a doctrine that is a lot less hospitable? Or are you going to actually just tarry with people in love and work towards what you can to improve things? And I think there's a tendency, again, with the internet to find ourselves dislodged from contexts that give us this sort of duty of care and concern and negotiation and good compromise, and puts us all in the position of the isolated Elijah who has no tethers, who has no bonds, who has no direct responsibilities that might constrain him, whereas Obadiah does. If Obadiah causes too much trouble, the hundreds of prophets of the Lord that he's protecting are going to die. And so he needs to operate somehow within the system in a way that's not rocking too many boats, but which is nonetheless faithful. And so I think our task often is to find some way to hold together our deep principles and our theological thinking without making that an ideological thing that untethers us from the communities of concern and loyalty that we belong to, while also enabling us to recognize when the time has come for us to get out, when the time has come that a compromise would take us over a line. For instance, one of the decisions that you'll have to make in choosing it, in being in a church, is at what point is this really jeopardizing your children's spiritual health? Now, you might be able to cope in that context, having all sorts of things to preserve your spiritual health, a sort of mask to put on with various other communities that protect you. But if you're raising your kids within that context, you have different sorts of decisions to make. So I think it might be helpful to consider this relative to the sorts of communities that we find ourselves in as churches. So many of the Elijahs have ended up untethered from church community. And as a result, they are actively compromising. And they're actively compromising on one of the most essential duties of Christian life, which is not forsaking meeting together, maintaining bonds of love and recognition with fellow Christians, and seeking to build each other up in a way that is conducive to the health of the church and that will not rip it apart and cause dissension and fracture needlessly. There are ways that we can be peacemakers and yet do that in compromised situations and yet remain pure and peaceful. And that is the challenge that we need to negotiate. When do we take the step of actually breaking with something?
Yeah, I mean, I think about Calvin and the wheat and the tares, probably Augustine too, but Calvin and the Anabaptists. And the Bible, yeah. Jesus, I could quote Jesus there. But that element of the wheat and the tares and letting them grow up together and if there's no church that's good enough, if there's no community, no institution, and you have to go off and become, a stylite up on a pillar, because the world has become too unclean. There's this level of an over-realized eschatology of like the purity of any church, any institution, any body that you join to do any good. And so just being aware of that dynamic, it is just so widespread. But unfortunately, this is whatever the Protestant critique of the monks, or at least the stylites, maybe some monks. But when you become so concerned with that kind of purity that it neglects love of neighbor, when you can actually draw near to your neighbor in relations, in the kinds of community that have the sorts of impure, imperfect, whatever people who, then you've gone too far. I mean, put it this way. Blast zones are pure, right? And everything's been, the fires have come through and consumed everything that's impure, and there's nothing left. And sometimes our passions can burn like that. But if you've gone so far that you don't have that kind of community, or you can't imagine one, or you'd rather see the whole thing burn to the ground. Now, I know the reply to some of that is there's some institutions that get so corrupt and so evil and so wicked that, yeah, burn them to the ground. I get that. But for your average, I guess your average one, where you've got your mix, you've got your wheat and your tares, it is rare to find an only tare, an only chaff kind of institution.
Well, so I think being a classical Protestant is so difficult. Because we have both poles here. We have of like continuing, we're a reform movement, not a revolution, but also not a repristination. And you try to avoid Donatism, or what you could even call, I've heard someone call it ecclesiological Pelagianism, right? Where you've got to be in the pure church and it's kind of like tethered to your salvation. So we've got that kind of built-in resistance. And at the same time, we are a prophetic movement, right? Working from the inside at our origins, but increasingly kind of taking on that demeanor of reform from the, in our own sense of what is inside, but also, I mean, I do pray, even as a Protestant, that eventually Rome would be reformed, right? I mean, I'm not losing that hope. And so you kind of live in this paradoxical tension. And I think our stories shape us a lot. I think this plays out in politics. The mythos of your nation does set certain trajectories. America is a nation of freedom. Whatever else you want to value, you've got to value freedom, And so, and it's part of our story. But I also think ecclesiologically, theologically, this plays out too in being Protestant. Like everybody thinks they're having their Martin Luther moment at Worms, here I stand, I can do no other. And it's like, yeah, but not every issue is justification by faith alone and, sola scriptura, and a lot of things that you're actually defending under that banner, I don't think are Christian, but so there's the Martin Luther, you also have in the Presbyterian orbit, right? Machen's warrior children, right? Like, people who are, and we do the history, Rome was right on this critique, right? That we're setting up a trajectory of a continual splintering. And I think we've got to figure out how to redress that internally. I think it's possible to, but it is a liability of our situation. And the other thing I was just thinking with this is one of my favorite theorists of theological approach, theological hermeneutics, theological method is a Catholic named Cardinal Avery Dulles, and he has this great book on the Catholicity of the Church, and he's pulling from Paul Tillich, who's a weirdo Protestant who I don't necessarily like, but I like.
Man, a Catholic quoting a liberal Protestant. Yeah. Where are we going with this, James?
But what Tillich,
where are we going with this, James?
What Tillich coined and then Dulles adopted, and then I'm stealing for myself, is there is a generative tension between the Catholic principles and the Protestant principle of the Catholic principle of like institutional, organic continuity, historical continuity, and then the Protestant of like disruption. The Spirit can break in, and I think it's hard to live in that tension because the pull is to one or the other, and I think it's related to this. And I think the outside agitators, it makes sense to me that this is maybe more endemic among Protestants, right? We have these people. It's not just the online problem; it's also, I think, part of our DNA. But the other thing I was going to say about the online thing is I think the other thing that the online thing makes this also messy is, when you're making this, you're building up this audience, you're making these comments online, it's both disembodied, it's untethered from an actual community that you were stewarding over and caring for, and therefore that will lead you to all prudential judgments. That's one part. It's not only disembodied, but also it gives you this sense of being omnipresent. And so you feel like you have a responsibility to speak about everything, right? And so these guys will pull you in, these online figures, these Elijahs online. Why aren't you speaking about this? It's like, dude, I can't speak about everything all the time. And I think that's where also the social media dynamic messes with us.
What do you want? I'm in Canada. No, but I mean, literally, like in 100 years ago, 100 years ago, what was happening across, even in your own denomination, you're like, man, I didn't hear about that. I didn't hear about that until General Assembly, even if we had one. That is a real thing. The other thing is the illusion of that there are different kinds of activity, different kinds of movement. Online dynamics prioritize public dramatized speech that is almost always performed in front of everybody, whether or not it's actually effective. Whereas oftentimes, when you're in institutions, oftentimes some of those aggressive speech that happens, some of those aggressive prophetic speech that can happen, might happen in a phone call where you're calling somebody, dude, what are you doing? Are you crazy? And it's like, why are you so silent? I'm not silent. I'm just not tweeting it. I am chewing whoever it is out, like in private, which is how oftentimes confrontations are most effective because they're actual personalized confrontations between one soul and another, which is often how Jesus has us do things, and not public performances to potentially boost my platform in front of a watching world on the back of the person that I'm criticizing. Now, obviously, public sins call for public speech. Public sins call for public correction. But sometimes the dynamic shifts when you privately correct and a person publicly repents. Sometimes that's the better move. Oftentimes, it's like, hey, you know what? I could chew you out, and I would be saying the truth publicly, and this is out, whatever. But it could be I could call you, and you might actually I might call you behind the scenes, and then it turns out that you see your sin, and then you publicly repent, and that's actually just better. It's better for the institution. It's better for everybody involved. But you can't. It's not something you can point to. Hey, I had that private conversation. Let me show it to you. So these are some of the institutional dynamics that insider outsider perspective. Oftentimes, there's an optical there's a difference there.
Social media, I think, puts us all in the position of being public persons. I think James getting at some of this, as were you, Derek, that we are all expected to speak on all these sorts of issues that are we simply lack knowledge and competence to speak to. We do not know the situation on the ground, and yet we're expected to arrive at a judgment because we have been cast as public persons, because social media is now the public space. And that creates a situation that is anti-subsidiarity, anti-dealing with things at the level which is closest to the level where they can be dealt with effectively and in a way that's near to the ground, that sees the issues and can address them appropriately. What we have is people who are viewing from a distance, casting judgment because they are expected to do so. And that makes a sort of Elijah-like ministry one that is primarily operating with very weak optics, that has not often engaged in deep investigation. Sometimes it has, but often it is not, or at least its traction arises from lots of people commenting who do not have deep knowledge of the actual issues on the ground. And I think one of the challenges here is, how can we create a situation where these two ministries, Elijah is a good guy. He's appointed.
He's a hero.
Prophet. He's a hero.
He's my guy. I love Elijah.
And we should not dismiss what he's doing, even though he is corrected by God. Yet at the same time, Obadiah is also described as a faithful man. What does it look like when Elijah and Obadiah recognize each other as being on the same team and manage their approach accordingly? That, it seems to me, is the real question.
I think trust is a big part of this. I mean, I think that because there can be different vocations, and you can even have different vocations at different times of your institutional placement. And I just think, like, one of the things that gets really irritating about how this plays out online, it's a bunch of different types of figures. It's not just one. I think our audience might think they're just thinking about this one person. We're not. Like, there are across the spectrum.
We had a list of 15 that we discussed before.
But what's frustrating is, for instance, I tried to steelman earlier because I really believe there's a steelman case to be made for these kind of outside reformists, right? And I would call them maybe activists. And they use a hammer. They're a little bit more blunt. direct, to the point. There's a place for that, and there's a place for the insider who's trying to reform from within, carry forward. And I think where we all feel the frustration is when they can't, they don't trust each other, and they don't show public respect for each other. And it's just, they are, each side of that dynamic can constantly like nitpick and undermine the work of the other. And then it becomes, just a cycle where they keep doing it to each other. And I think both sides lose from that dynamic.
It's like the journalist politician dynamic of like the journalist who's my job is to report, expose, et cetera, and the politician is like, hey, I'm trying to get, I almost had this, and then you blew it up with that story, and now this person is offended, and I can't get him back to the table, et cetera, and
or the undercover detective who's been working with the mafia for 20 years.
Yeah, you blew my story. Yeah, that's the whole thing. Yeah, right. So, and this is where I have to appeal to, I have to think providentially. I think there needs to be more mutual understanding, grace, and personally, there needs to be a lack of, it is hard. It's hard because you need some people who are suspicious, who pull on threads and uncover stuff, right? You can think about, sex abuse scandals and all that. Like, this is necessary. There's stuff that's been covered up by insiders and institutions. It absolutely needs to get laid bare. And so, in the providence of God, I have to think that he put both Obadiah and Elijah in the scripture for us to reflect on both. Because there are some people who need to reflect on the fact that there's an Obadiah there. And there's some people that need to reflect on the fact that, like, you need Elijah from the outside calling it down. And honestly, the charges, I mean, the Obadiahs, I'm sure him hearing Elijah's preaching was important for him to remember the pure call of God, the fidelity of the covenant, and all that. Like, he probably needed to hear that, even as he was working in the government as he was, and so that was there. And Elijah's not always going to know what's going on secretly, because here's the thing: if he told him, he's like, "Hey, Elijah, don't worry, I got this." Loose lips sink ships when it comes to hiding prophets in caves. There's certain things that they're probably just going to have to be some misunderstandings in history. Or at the last day, there's going to be vindications and resurrections, and there are going to be people who actually recognize each other in the kingdom of God as having been mutually working towards the same end from different ways, even though in this life they didn't know it. And that's kind of one of those things where, like, we live in history, and there are always going to be unresolved tensions that God will providentially resolve at the eschaton, and that's it. And I think it's sometimes all we can do is actually just be aware that this dynamic is at work and broadly factored in, even if in the moment that may be the case, but in the moment I may still be called to speak truth as I see it, or in the moment I may still be called to try and do my best to work behind the scenes to get this movement done.
I do think an important part of this is the difference between a sort of systemic suspicion, which you often see within the sort of Elijah complex. It's a radical distrust of institutions, a sense that they are entirely corrupt. And you see this in a lot of the way that politicians are represented in government. And when you know people within these institutions, you just know it's a lot more complicated than that. It's seldom straightforwardly corrupt. There are people making difficult decisions and negotiating things. And the very best situation is when there is someone who will ask the really tough questions, who is not caught by the incentives that are perverse within the institution, that isn't trapped within the structure and the hierarchy that would prevent speaking out, for instance, or whistleblowing. And that person is able to, on the one hand, be attentive to the dynamics that are not entirely corrupt, recognize some of the perverse incentives, and recognize some of the difficult decisions and compromises that are being made, and be able to work with people who are within without just being in a position where they want to burn the whole thing down, where they're not driven by radical suspicion or hostility to institutions, but they are seeking the best for the institutions, where there are people who are not simply opposed to everything that's going on in government, but actually recognize the difficulty of the decisions that face government and what it would look like to believe the best and yet to be prepared to ask the really tough questions that would unearth corruption and evil. And that negotiation, it seems to me, is very difficult to have when everything tends to polarize into pro-institutional or anti-institutional or suspicion or just complete naive belief in various parties. And this, it seems to me, is exhibited on both sides. Both sides of these sorts of debates have their own institutions, and both sides can be very naive about their own institutions and the compromises that are being made, and aren't at least auditing them on those fronts. And then both sides can be incredibly suspicious and hostile to the compromises that are being made on other sides without actually considering, okay, what's being negotiated here? What goods are people trying to preserve? And what does a non-cynical perspective upon this look like? Are there parties within this camp that we could find a goodwill coalition with? Is there some way we can engage with some parties who want to reform things from within? All of those sorts of questions, it seems to me, are the ones that we should initially be, at the very least, be pursuing. And often that's the way that reform occurs. And it doesn't involve burning everything down, but it does involve a concern for purity, a concern for transparency, all these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think another angle, a motif that I was thinking about, besides just the purity motif, is also the motif of courage. And oftentimes in these debates, right, there's a very narrow conception of what courage looks like. And I do think outside speech can be courageous. But if that's your only mode and you're always outside and you're just lobbing bombs on the other, even if that other is an institution you care about and you kind of align with in certain respects, that can be that can be presented as a type of I'm the courageous one. And oftentimes, like what you're saying, Alistair, there's a lot of different forms of courage that are being performed from the inside that is unseen. And so when you're working for reform from inside and you're having to work with people and you're making pretty bold statements that never get the light of day, but you're trying to keep it in-house, and it could ruin your career, and it could harm your friendship, and it can make your life really miserable at your institution. Like, that is also a form of courage that doesn't get a lot of play. And I think that's another factor that
courage to be misunderstood. Guys, there's so much more we could keep going here. Once you start talking about purity and there's a whole element of like sanctification and holiness and reconsecration and the making whole of things that have been pulled apart. And we would do that, but we probably have to land the plane here. So guys, thank you for this conversation. Alistair, thanks for setting it up. James, thank you for your contributions. And if you have stuck around this far, thank you for listening. Please, if you found this helpful in any ways, rate or review us on iTunes, Spotify, share the episode, join the Patreon, join Mere Orthodoxy. But for now, this has been Mere Fidelity.